Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I can see that Veronique's here. So thank you very much for joining our panel. As you know, this is our panel on fighting against impunity for gender-based crimes. And then we're going to be discussing the possibility of a policy paper on gender persecution. So that's an initiative about which we're going to hear quite a bit about in the next hour. So I want to thank everyone for being here, those who are logged in and our panelists, and I want to thank also Outright International for sponsoring this event. My name is René Urueña, and I'm a law professor at Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, and a visiting professor at the City University of New York. And I'm very happy to be here because this is kind of a very important initiative in which several colleagues all around the world have been working on trying to develop new ways of thinking about the gender persecution in the context of international criminal law. So basically what we want to do today is to discuss, while at the same time the sexual and gender-based crimes are among the gravest crimes in the Rome Statute, and investigating and prosecuting those crimes is a key priority for the International Criminal Court. We still don't have a lot of materials of how to prosecute, prove, and find evidence on the crime of persecution as an expression of gender persecution. And that's why it's so important that in furtherance of that goal, the ICC prosecutor, ICC meaning the International Criminal Court prosecutor, intends to publish a policy paper on gender persecution as a crime against humanity. So this may sound disconnected from what is happening on the ground, the kind of violence that we're seeing, but as our panelists are going to explain, it's a crucial tool and a crucial link to understand how the development of international criminal law is going to be useful to bring justice on the field. And that's why our panelists today will explore different forms of gender-based crimes and why this new policy is important, obviously. And we want to also hear from you. So what specific steps are you taking towards publishing these policy papers, and perhaps this policy paper, and perhaps also understand the challenges, the challenges that you are facing. So to talk about that, we have our first panelist, Lisa Davis. Lisa is a special advisor on gender persecution and an associate professor of law at the City University of New York Law School, where she co-directs the Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic. So Lisa, perhaps you could give us a general introduction and tell us why this new gender persecution policy paper initiative at the Office of the ICC Prosecutor is so important. Why do you think this paper should be developed, and what are, as I told you, the steps and perhaps the challenges that you're facing, and that the overall community that is developing this initiative is facing in this context? Lisa?
All right, well, thanks, Renee. And, big thanks to OutSummit for putting together this event, and to Outright International for sponsoring it, and to everyone who came out to speak today. It's great to have this turnout and to be able to talk about this really important issue. So what is the issue? Well, we know that wartime abuses against LGBTIQ, non-binary, and gender non-conforming persons aren't new. They're as old as human history. And they date back in modern international criminal law back as far as World War II. And we also know that everywhere in the world where there's conflicts, that armed actors perpetrate gender-based crimes that can amount to gender persecution in an effort to reinforce oppressive, discriminatory gender narratives. Problem is that they're rarely documented when they happen, and perpetrators are hardly ever held accountable. And as a result, they're often excluded from consideration by international and domestic tribunals. And in effect, they're left out of history. I mean, think about it. Can you name a tribunal that has successfully held accountable crimes committed against LGBTIQ people because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation or gender identity or sex characteristics? I mean, it's never happened. And only in the past year or so have we started to see this issue be discussed and percolate up into tribunals, but it's brand new, even though this is an issue that is super old. And that's because international criminal jurisprudence, it's silent on gender persecution. And when I say gender persecution, that's the name of the crime on the law books that we use to address crimes committed against LGBTIQ, gender non-conforming, non-binary persons, that happen because of their gender. And this silence in the law books and in the jurisprudence, that is from a lack of understanding and recognition of this intent to discriminate against people because of their gender. And we need to flesh this out, which is like the purpose of this policy paper. And it's important because we need to show how this discrimination works, how it's a factor in why these crimes happen. Because if we don't, we're only getting half the story. So sure, we'll get the rape, the torture, the murder, but if we don't get why these crimes happen, why the victims who were attacked were chosen, if we don't get that part of the story, then we're missing an entire part of the story that needs to be told. I mean, look at the example of what's happening in terms of the movement for racial justice in the United States. Without acknowledging racist motivations behind the beatings and murders of Black people that have been committed by authorities, police brutality can't be holistically addressed. It's similar here. And the refusal to understand the discriminatory intentions that motivate perpetrators to commit rape or torture or murder, it does little to guarantee non-repetition. And it's not enough to hold perpetrators accountable for these crimes, right? Justice requires an understanding of how perpetrators justify the acts that they do, if we're truly going to root out discrimination and break cycles of violence. So, if we had gender persecution move forward, if we had a way to recognize gender discrimination when it happens in these types of crimes, it would demonstrate to the world that targeting women, girls, LGBTIQ, non-binary, gender non-conforming persons because of their gender is a crime against humanity. It would also promote a survivor-centered approach, and it would provide access to greater participation to survivors of these crimes, simply by just recognizing that they exist as survivors of these crimes. And that would do a lot in terms of enhancing accountability in transitional justice mechanisms. And, it's been long debated whether international criminal court's definition of gender includes this idea of discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. And the short answer is yes. Yes, it does. And that is why this policy paper is so important. It would give a voice to victims backed by the force of law and provide us with a deeper understanding of the root causes of violence. And in this way, the policy paper won't only contribute to furthering investigations of gender persecution, it'll also enhance justice for victims of these crimes by drawing on relevant international jurisprudence. So that's why I'm excited to say that I'm taking the lead on drafting this new policy paper on gender persecution in my role as the special advisor on gender persecution to the International Criminal Court prosecutor. And it's really important in drafting this policy that there be a lot of input and consultation with civil society and other key stakeholders, because that's how we're going to ensure we get a comprehensive and thoroughly considered policy paper. So it's important to hear from communities. It's important to hear from survivors. It's important to hear from activists so that we can get a policy paper that holistically covers our rights and recognizes them in the way that they deserve to be. And, hopefully this policy paper will also serve as a guide to national authorities, in terms of their work holding perpetrators accountable for these crimes. So there's a lot to be done, but it's an exciting moment to finally define rights under international criminal law We have a ton of jurisprudence under international human rights law, but we have almost nothing under international criminal law. So we need this to be robust, and we need it to be great. Now, just to put out there, the deadline to make a submission is March 18th. And in about a day or two, there's going to be more information available on the International Criminal Court website. And, we can pass that on to Outright. I'm just going to volunteer them to let all of you know about that. And I know that Danny at Madre, who's here speaking to us, also is going to help put a push out to get civil society input into this paper. So I hope all of you will consider that and make your voice heard. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. So, I mean, clearly the discussion is fundamentally important, in developing this kind of knowledge and this kind of materials is useful not only at the international level, but as you were mentioning, at the domestic level. But part of the coverage, I guess, is the LGBTIQ dimension. So there's this tension also that I guess it would require particular attention in terms of differentiated both policy and developments of the law in terms of treatment of LGBTIQ folks. And that's why we also have as a panelist here Nila Ghoshal. Nila is the Director of Law and Policy at Outright Action International, that clearly as an expert on these issues can tell us and perhaps complement a bit what Lisa was telling us about the overall, let's say, landscape of the policy paper. In particular, Nila, if you can help us understand better, what do gender-based crimes look like in conflict or atrocity against LGBTIQ persons? So perhaps you can help us understand better kind of the differentiated impact. What kind of things should Lisa consider when developing this overall gender persecution paper in terms of LGBTIQ persons? Nila?
Thank you so much, Renee, and thank you, Lisa, for kicking us off. I want to say that I'm so excited to be here and be part of this conversation. And that is because, as someone who's been working in the LGBTIQ communities to conduct advocacy for the last 10 years, I also had a previous history of about 5 years working in the international justice sector, and was a queer woman working in international justice, but was not working on queer issues at all because they were completely invisible. And so I am very well aware from my personal experience that in the decades of work in international courts, in academia, in the NGO sector, on understanding and documenting international crimes, bringing perpetrators to justice, sexual orientation, gender identity, and in particular, sex characteristics have gone almost completely unnoticed. I, in the mid-2000s, was working with genocide survivors in Guatemala and in Burundi. I did my master's degree on civil conflict, human rights, and transitional justice. And during that time, I did an internship at the International Criminal Tribunal on Rwanda. And in all of these contexts, gender came up. But when gender was discussed at all, it was with regard to sexual violence against women and girls, and the topic of LGBTIQ people just wasn't in the picture. And so I'm thrilled now to be working with Outright, which is one of the organizations that has sought to put wartime persecution of LGBTIQ people on the map and on the international agenda. And one of the ways we did that was in 2015, Outright organized the first ever briefing before the UN Security Council on violence against LGBTIQ people, which was focused on the atrocities that the Islamic State was perpetrating in Iraq and Syria. We had at that time documented over 30 killings, primarily of gay and transgender men. Other organizations, including Madre, were also documenting murders of lesbian women. And we went to the Security Council because we sought to urge world governments to take these issues seriously as international security issues and to protect people who were targeted by this kind of extremist persecution in Iraq and Syria. I have to say, at the time, I was not with Outright. I was watching Outright from the outside, and I was thinking this was a bit of a gamble. Was the Security Council really going to take these issues seriously? The Security Council was dealing with genocide, with a whole range of conflicts. Plus, we had countries like Russia and China as permanent members. At the time, Nigeria was sitting on the Security Council, which had just passed a really atrocious anti-LGBTQ law. And I wondered whether the Security Council would take these kinds of crimes against LGBTIQ people seriously. But they did, they listened. And I think one thing that Outright succeeded with in bringing this issue to the Security Council was giving anti-LGBTQ abuses in conflict the highest public profile attention that they had ever received. 6 years later, it feels like the situation has changed a lot, that things have developed, and now our issues are in almost every international arena, in almost every space in the UN system. LGBTIQ issues are being discussed. And so we know now that when they are not on the international agenda, there's a glaring gap there. And international criminal justice is one of the places where that lacuna still lingers. So we need to close the gap. We need to demand justice for our communities when people do experience persecution based on sexuality, gender, or sex characteristics. The International Criminal Court was set up to prosecute genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And that includes, as Lisa said, persecution on the basis of gender. But even with regard to violence against cis women, the International Criminal Court has not accomplished a great deal in this regard. So far, nobody has been convicted on grounds of gender persecution at all. And so in bringing light to the need to document, prosecute, and bring to justice crimes against LGBTIQ people, I think we need to work hand in hand with the women's movement, with feminist movements, to ensure that all of these crimes get the international attention that they deserve. Right now, the ICC has cases open in countries including Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Sudan, Kenya, Libya, Congo, Mali, and Uganda. There are also open investigations by the Office of the Prosecutor in other countries, including Georgia, Burundi, Venezuela, Afghanistan, Palestine, Myanmar, and the Philippines. But in only 2 of these cases are prosecutors even looking at gender persecution so far, and that is not involving gender persecution against LGBTIQ persons. And looking at this list of countries, it's preposterous to assume that in this diverse array of conflicts, that there is no violence happening against LGBTIQ people on the basis of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or sex characteristics. But unless prosecutors know how to and are empowered to look for evidence of these crimes, unless they talk to the right people, including LGBTIQ civil society, and ask the right questions, they will not find these cases that are happening. I want to talk about some of the ways briefly in which LGBTIQ people are particularly at risk in armed conflicts. Of course, we know that in the case of extremist groups such as ISIS, people are targeted directly for execution based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. And we also have seen situations like Chechnya, where the security forces are systematically subjecting gay and bisexual men to torture and enforced disappearance. But even when we are not dealing with a regime that systematically believes that all queer people should be killed or tortured, our communities are at heightened risk. And here are some of the ways in which that happens. First, in any militarized society, LGBTIQ people face unique risk at physical checkpoints. When you get to a checkpoint, your value as a human being and your identity are subject to scrutiny. Your appearance is interrogated, your phone is searched, your identity documents are checked. You might be patted down or subjected to a strip search. And it's clear how vulnerable LGBTIQ people, particularly gender non-conforming people, can be in such circumstances. And this is something that we've documented in countries ranging from Honduras to Pakistan to Afghanistan. Secondly, LGBTIQ people are vulnerable to personal settling of scores in civil conflicts. When neighbors and communities turn against each other, or when individuals need to secure their own safety by demonstrating that they are on the same side of an armed group, LGBTIQ people can become sacrificial lambs who are turned in as a way to score points. This is something that Outright is currently documenting in Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover. Third, there's a long history of sexual violence against gay and bisexual men, lesbian and bisexual women, and trans people that is carried out specifically to punish them for their sexual orientation and gender identity, including by members of security forces all around the world. And there's insufficient documentation of the prevalence of sexual violence against intersex people, but we can certainly assume that it happens. Now, when you get into a conflict setting where sexual violence is used as a weapon of war and a means of reinforcing toxic masculinity and rigid gender binaries, we need to remind our colleagues in the international justice movement that queer people are going to be targeted and are going to suffer from sexual violence, but also that barriers to reporting that kind of sexual violence for LGBTIQ people are extremely high, and prosecutors will not identify these cases unless they assiduously and sensitively seek them out. Fourth, trans and gender non-conforming people cannot easily obtain identity documents, such as passports, that allow them to flee armed conflict. They're often essentially sitting ducks, which is another thing that we're finding right now in our current research on Afghanistan. So we need an understanding of gender-based persecution that takes into account these forms of violence that are likely to take place to some extent in almost any form of armed conflict. Outright is looking forward to engaging with the Office of the Prosecutor at the ICC to ensure, first, that gender-based persecution is interpreted inclusively. Second, that prosecutors and other court officials are equipped to investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate these cases. And third, that in addressing gender persecution, the ICC is focused not just on prosecution, but also on redress, compensation, and support for survivors, which our communities desperately need in situations of armed conflict. We look forward to collaborating with the ICC, with the Office of the Prosecutor, to push this issue forward and to make sure that we are on the agenda.
Thanks, Nila. Thank you very much. So a lot of things there, and I think we can continue talking about that, particularly that last part on reparations and compensations is crucially important, and I think that has not been discussed that much, and I'm really looking forward to hear what Lisa can also tell us about that, those issues that are crucially important. And just as the discussion on LGBTIQ persons, the other dimension clearly in terms of gender persecution is obviously children. So when children are being affected in the context of armed conflicts or atrocities, either through recruitment or victimization as non-combatants, the problem of persecution emerges, particularly as sex violence, but in general, this conflict, so this dimension of persecution emerges in a very distinct way. And that dimension is also crucially important to be discussed in the context of the policy paper, and that's why we have with us today our third panelist, Veronique Aubert, who is the Special Advisor on Crimes Against and Affecting Children and Lead on Children and Armed Conflict at Save the Children in the United Kingdom. So Veronique, thank you very much for being with us. And we were wondering, so following this conversation, listening to Lisa and Nila, based on your professional experience and role as a special advisor, what do you suggest, Veronique, could be so what could the gender persecution policy recommend to ensure that the persecution of children on gender grounds is integrated into the OTP's work and it's prioritized? So Veronique, thank you very much for being with us, and perhaps you can help us think how to integrate the issue of children and the persecution on the basis of gender of children in the context of the policy paper. Veronique?
Thank you very much, Renee. And thank you very much, Outright, for organizing this meeting. I mean, I have to say I'm a special advisor for about 3 months. And I'm certainly not an expert on gender persecution. So I've done a lot of homework in the last few weeks, thanks to Lisa. And it's been fascinating, actually. You know, I think it's like everyone, I welcome, you know, the fact that Lisa now is going to be putting a proposal that there will be a real focus and attention to sexual and gender-based crimes that are considered among the gravest crime in the Rome Statute, and that there is a real interest in investigating and prosecuting those crimes as a matter of priority. I think it's been really interesting to hear Nila, you know, really giving an interesting mapping of some of the risk and threats and actual crimes committed against LGBTIQ community in conflicts. Because on my end, when I started doing some research a few weeks ago on crimes committed against LGBTIQ children in armed conflict, you know, and by children, we don't speak only about 4 or 5 years old. We speak 12, we speak 14, we speak 16, 17 years old boys and girls, and transgender and so forth. And it's been a real shock to see how this aspect has been remarkably unreported and undocumented. You know, it's not surprising because usually documentation on crimes against children, you know, tend to be not really disaggregated. You know, children usually are left a little bit in unsituated or ageless analysis. Their intersecting identities are really unspecified. You know, you get reports, scores of children have been killed here. Many girls have been raped there, but you don't have any information about whether these are 5 years old or 12-year-old or whether, So usually there is always a saying that children's crimes against children are pretty much erased, and certainly that their suffering is erased by the fact that they are so unsituated and ageless. But with regard to LGBTIQ children, it's not only that the data is not disaggregated, but there is very, very little data and documentation and research. So I consulted my organization, Save the Children, and I'm supposed to talk to our expert who was traveling in the last 2 weeks, and we have a meeting next week, and I've already put a whole request because for the last 6 years, we've been producing a report on children in war, the War on Children report by Save the Children, and there is always a thematic. And I was like, okay, I had to make a submission. Here's my submission for next year, is to have a whole focus of the real proper research analysis with facts about human rights violation and crimes committed against LGBTIQ children in situation of armed conflict. Now, I have to say, maybe Outright, maybe others have really managed to document this, but from my general research and talking to human rights organization and the High Commissioner for Human Rights and HRW and Amnesty and so forth, looked at all the Commission of Inquiries report and everything. It's been very hard to find information. So I was thinking, what can be done then, and what shall we advise the ICC or institution like the ICC to do? Well, first, I suspect that when they're going to be looking at gender persecution, the link with sexual violence will be, rapidly made. And I think I'd like to make an underlying point that LGBTQI children are targeted on gender basis beyond sexual and gender-based violence, but there is also on issue related to recruitment, enslavement, murder, deprivation of liberty, torture, attacks on the education, and so forth. So I think the court tend to assimilate gender-based violation with sexual violence, and I think there are many more crimes that LGBTQI children might be facing that are, it's a broader area, and there is a real need to have a lens to look at the different crimes on this basis. And the other aspect is, when you look at children, and again, when you think about LGBTIQ children, you might be thinking, Nila, that I'm talking about 14-year-old and Hone about an 8-year-old. And it's exactly the problem with children, is that it's not an homogeneous group, and you really need to capture the specific and overlapping children identities. So with regard to my first point, well, really, out of the 452 million children, I tried to look, Save the Children saying about 452 million children, youth living in conflict zone, 1 in 6 globally. I tried to find how many of them were LGBTQ children. Of course, I don't find a number, but what I know is that those children are facing a huge number of crimes that are committed in the context of persecution based on ethnic, national, religious, political grounds. But with regard to gender persecution, as it was mentioned, the link with sexual violence, against girls has often been made, and it's understandable. We know that sexual violence is impacting girls a lot. But even just this assumption mean that it's been also very scarce documentation about sexual violence against boys. And it's interesting to look at Afghanistan, for example, where the UN reported that the highest number of sexual violence cases in 2019 were against boys. And that was probably attributable to the fact that the underreporting again of sexual violence against girls was pretty high, and also relating to the Bashabazi practice where in some communities, young boys between the age of 10 and 18 are purchased and trafficked by powerful men for entertainment and sex slave practice. But this absence of gender lens analysis mean that violence against LGBTQI children in conflict-related sexual violence is not documented or at least not that much, nor is analyzed. While I did find some information, on the other hand, that the targeting of person based on their actual or perceived gender identity in Myanmar, Colombia, Syria was very prevalent. So it's really interesting to see, we know it's prevalent. There is a raising, an awareness raising, and I think it was really interesting to hear Nila looking, back in the last 10 years and so forth. There is definitely a strengthened advocacy effort. But in terms of research, analysis, and fact, I think with regard to under 18, we're still very far behind. So yeah, there has been progress made with regard to the protection of LGBTIQ people in human rights law, but really crimes against LGBTIQ children and youth are largely absent from the international humanitarian law discourse. And I will lobby Lisa and the court to really make sure that this is, they are under 18, but they do really need to be, a focus as well. And we need to understand much more how LGBTQI children are victims, and so that would require dedicated analysis, understanding the cultural context, the linguistic context, and so forth. And it's been interesting to read some from the UNHCR, the High Commission for Refugees global review that is an effort to protect LGBTQI asylum seekers and refugees. And they highlighted really that parties to conflict disproportionately subject LGBTQI children to discrimination, homicide, torture, displacement, sexual violence. So a lot of the refugees or asylum seekers they're talking to that are under 18 have been victims of these crimes. And that actually their actual or perceived non-conforming sexual orientation, gender identity may aggravate the children's vulnerability. So already they are children, so they might have lost their parents, or they might have, everything that relates to vulnerabilities of child and different awareness and so forth. On top of that, the sexual orientation might be making them even more vulnerable to sexual violence, but to other crimes. In general, gender stereotypes are evident everywhere. In recruitment, there is always, when there is a crime of recruitment, an assumption that it's going to be boys that are going to be used to fight as fighters, as child soldiers. But that means that, the sexual violence inflicted on those child soldiers that are boys very often is not documented and reported. In the same way, girls that are being recruited as a child by the military are assumed to be there for sexual purposes, but their role actually as combatant is completely ignored as well. It's been interesting to really see how some of the crimes are committed, in terms of enslavement and use, and in terms of Yazidi children. We've really seen some very young children being recruited, and for the boys to be sent to religious school and then militarized, and the girls being systematically sent to religious school and then sent as slave and a laborer and servants, with definition of what they will be then suffering as crimes been defined from the beginning by the sex they have. And gender persecution against children in general, including LGBTIQ children, might also encompass the crime of murder, which the court is really usually, when the court has looked at children, there's been mostly on recruitment, a little bit on sexual violence, but killings of boys or girls or LGBTQI children, there's been very little documentation, although we know, for example, that boys are killed and men in conflict by excessive use of force, deliberate targeting, landmines, or are used as human shield because they are boys and because they are expected to be outside and permitted to be outside, while girls usually might be spending more time at home. But that doesn't mean that they don't end up being victim of violation and crimes, because at home they are also victim of more domestic crime and sexual violence and so forth. But it's been interesting to see in Nigeria, where girls have been there's been more girls killed as suicide bomber, the suicide attack bomber than boys, because girls are used, because of the gender, to be as a strategic advantage, because they are perceived as non-threatening and as victim rather than perpetrators. So they've been used as a suicide bomber. And then other form of crimes that are committed on gender basis include the deprivation of liberty and torture. As we, there are 35,000 under 18 children that are reportedly deprived of liberty in the context of conflict and war, that face torture and ill treatment in detention or have died because of this condition. But the detention also significantly increase the children's vulnerability to other crimes like sexual violence and so forth. And we know that children belonging to the LGBTQI community are much more likely to be arrested, much more likely to be detained because of their gender identity, but also at particular risk of sexual violence in detention. Boys are also often victims in these circumstances because boys are also very frequently detained more than girls, but girls are particularly vulnerable once they're in detention to sexual violence. So you constantly need to have a very, very acute lens to disaggregate the information. And my last example is on attack on education. Again, gender attacks will be very different according to gender, and there's been many more attacks on girls' school. I think there's been quite a lot reporting with the Boko Haram abduction of girls in Nigeria or in Afghanistan, the Taliban and ISIL and ISK, who have implemented policies to deny girls their fundamental rights to education. Doesn't mean that there hasn't been any boys' school not attacked, but it's on a different level. So, and then to conclude, my second recommendation to the court is to be looking, when you look at children, you don't only look at the different crimes that they will be affected by depending on the basis of their gender or sexual orientation, but also at the individual intersectionality framework that the term, but it's basically saying you need to look at the specific and overlapping children identities. An organization like my organization that Save the Children has really made a lot of research to show that without this disaggregation of data and information over the specificities of the child, then one group might be more visible than the other one. So one group being persecuted might be more visible than other, just because we're not, and that's exactly what's happening with LGBTQI youth and children, is that there's no data or not enough, and therefore they are really not. Other groups like children and adolescent boys with disabilities, we know that they are 3 or 4 times more likely to experience physical and sexual violence than other children, and that in some cases, in some conflict situation, about 50% of the boys and girls that are deaf have been sexually abused. But in prosecution, in investigation, and so forth, this group, whether it's girl or boys or LGBTIQI disabled children or youth, are also very invisible. So to conclude,
yeah, we need you to close because we still have Danny now and all right. So
I think it's just to say it's time for advocacy to call for more comprehensive child sensitivity and child sensitivity analysis and more scrutiny on LGBTIQ children and youth crimes committed.
Thank you. Sorry, Veronica. Sorry, we have a hard close at 12:45. Thank you very much. And Danny, so please, if you could tell us, so Danny Bradley is the Global Campaigns Officer for MADRE, an international human rights organization and grant making organization. And Danny, perhaps if you could tell us, we heard from Lisa that's important to have stakeholder submission for this policy paper. So perhaps you could tell us why you think this policy paper is important, particularly for civil society, and explain what role should civil society play in this development. Danny, please.
Sure. Thanks, Renee. And of course, thanks to Outright and OutSummit for having us today. First, just to situate Madre in this work. As Renee said, we're a grant-making foundation. We've been around for 38 years, providing $54 million to our support of grassroots partners around the world. Since back in the 90s, we were housing the Women's Caucus for Gender Justice that participated in the Rome Statute negotiations. And we've been really involved in promoting accountability for gender persecution ever since. Most recently with Outright, we've been working very closely to strengthen the gender norms within a new Crimes Against Humanity treaty. And we had a very successful campaign for that within the last few years. So we have a long history of this work. So to turn to your question, Renee, for civil society, this policy paper really presents a very groundbreaking opportunity for clarity on a topic that has been overlooked for too long. As we've heard, the policy paper will be an important resource for the International Criminal Court, for governments, for the Office of the Prosecutor and its investigations. But it will also be a vital instrument for civil society and grassroots movements to support them in strengthening accountability for gender persecution in their local communities and on the ground. Ultimately, all of this work is to uphold justice for victims and the survivors of gender persecution, and to strengthen accountability for the crimes that they faced. And civil society is best placed to provide that perspective that reflects the firsthand account of what these crimes are like when they occur. So civil society needs to bring our voices to this process to make sure that it really reflects the realities of how international law and gender persecution play out in reality on the ground. So for the development of this policy paper, Madre, along with Outright, we see our role as really fostering meaningful participation and facilitating broad stakeholder input. The more civil society input in this process, the better. So Madre plans to serve as the go-to for others to learn more about this submission process, so that as wide of an array as possible can share their perspectives and priorities to the Office of the Prosecutor. In the next few months, starting in 2022, we will hold a series of consultations, workshops, and panels to bring together as many stakeholders as possible to learn more about the point of the policy paper, its potential impact, how people can be involved in representing their communities. I think we have really amazing examples today of just two types of communities that are so diverse within that sector, having LGBTIQ representation, having children's rights representation. There is so many different groups of communities who can be included in this process, and it's really crucial that all of those voices be heard so that the policy paper is as inclusive as possible. Just really working together to make sure that this really incorporates international law standards, because it could make huge strides in promoting accountability. This policy paper could really impact the rights of people for generations. So we are very excited to be working on this with the Office of the Prosecutor. It's a really exciting moment to strengthen justice for gender persecution. And we will definitely be in touch with anyone and everyone who will listen to us in 2022 to make sure that we are all involved in this process. Thanks, Renee.
Thanks, Danny. And perhaps, Lisa, if you want to close up, so you've heard different approaches, different suggestions, and perhaps you could tell us not only, so how would this feed your work, but also what kind of timeline are we looking at in terms of the developing of the policy paper, and also how to get in touch, submit proposals and all that.
Okay, I know we only have 4 minutes left. Maybe there'd be time for a question, I don't know, but I would just say quickly that the deadline for submissions before the first draft comes out is March 18th. And there will be a web announcement on the ICC, I'm sure, hopefully on Madre and Outright's websites as well, with the email address of where to make those submissions. After that, the first draft will come out in early fall, and there'll be a shorter window of time to get in, technical comments to the draft once it's done. So really the bulk of the draft is going to be, informed by the submissions that we get by March 18th. And anyone can make a submission.
Wonderful.
It should be grounded in international law, or at least victims' experiences, because those are our driving factors. But hopefully folks will do that.
All right, so I think we have a very strict deadline here in terms of time. I don't know if people have any questions, so perhaps you could put it in the Q&A, and I'll be sure to transmit them to whoever wants whoever should answer the question. If not, then I'll start to close up, because I'm being told here that we need to start wrapping up. All right. Wonderful. All right. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, all the panelists, for your time, for sharing with us that information. And then what we'll do is, if there are any questions, I would ask Kevin to send me the questions, and then I'll make sure to distribute them and then have them answered back via email. So thank you very much. Danny, Lisa, Veronique, and Nila, thank you very much for your time sharing this information with us, and with all the people who are logged in. And then thank you also to Outright for organizing this panel. Thank you very much. And then I'll see you around. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.